Hey guys, last video was around talking about balance development throughout a stint. The whole thing was sparked by the Porsche Cup, which is a really nice car to learn driving in the game because you have less aids and everything is a little more pronounced, and definitely the driver plays a bigger role and you can't mask too much with the setup. So before diving into this video, if you haven't seen the last one, it's probably worth doing that first. However, let's dive in because today, instead of just talking about how balance changes, we'll add how to tackle that. And I want to start with, again, going back to the drawing board a bit and combining a few factors. And really what I want you to see here is, can we move this? We can. Let's start by defining what we're seeing. What I do, I've prepared a couple formulas and they will display how or which factor affects the car balance in which direction. And everything below the zero line will be a tendency or something that contributes towards understeer. Everything that is above the line means it contributes towards oversteer. So the first thing that we're seeing is F on X. I use that because fuel, F for fuel. And what this does is if the fuel tank is in the normal position, well, normal is a stretch, let's say towards the rear, like in the BMW that we drive day in and day out, then the car is in best balance really when the fuel tank is full, because it kind of counters the weight of the engine at the front, and this way the car has a nice balance in terms of where the weight sits or the center of the weight sits. Now, as we go through the stint and the fuel tank empties, you'll see the fuel is decreasing, the rear becomes lighter. This then means the front becomes the heavier part in comparison, and the car has a tendency to go more straight, which means understeer in racing terms, which is what this line is trying to show. So as the fuel empties throughout the stint, don't look at the laps here again. It's just to highlight the direction. You can see the car becomes more understeer as you go through the stint. We could of course change the numbers. It has a bigger impact or a smaller one. Will be wildly different on the Porsche, for example, with a fuel tank in the front, but just you have the picture, right? The weight balance shifts to the front, the car becomes more understeer. Now, the next thing that happens is, since all cars are really rear-wheel drive in ACC, yes, all, then we have another factor which usually leads to rear tire wear being more than front tire wear. So overall, for most cars, I guess there are only a few that really struggle with front tire wear more than rear. Let's say the Lexus or the Mercedes could be a candidate, but I'm not entirely sure. They actually wear the fronts more than the rear, and definitely not across all tracks. So mostly you will have more rear tire wear than you have front tire wear, and this will mean that as we had on the last video, the rear will get worse in comparison to the front, which means the car becomes more oversteery, which is now shown by the W of X formula, which is for wear, and this means the car is becoming more oversteery through the stint from that factor. The next one then is aero impact, and that is something we didn't have on the Cup cars so far, which if we take the BMW wheel, or let's say the Mercedes or the Ferrari or the Lambo, or probably most cars that have the fuel tank in the back, they will get more oversteery aero-wise as well, because when the tank is at the back, the rear lifts a couple millimeters. We'll have a look into ACC later, because there's a nice tool, as you might already know, for testing how the car will develop throughout the stint aerodynamic wise. But roughly, this is the tendency on most cars. So the aero one is depicting what the car is most likely going to change, or how the car is most likely going to change over stint in terms of aerodynamic balance. I made this a little more pronounced because it definitely on some cars outweighs the impact of tire and fuel, but again, they all play together. Then those are really the three things. And now if you add them all together, you get an overall balance, which then looks something like this, right? So taking all the impacts combined, wear, fuel load, and the weight balance changing, and the aerodynamic balance change leads to the red line, which means the car is becoming a lot more oversteery throughout the stint. And this is in the end what we want to address with the setup and with the driving. On the other hand, if you have a car that has a fuel tank in the front, then the impact will be quite a bit different because the aerodynamics will be different here as well. To be honest, you'd have to say the fuel impact here is in the other direction there as well, because the weight shifts further to the rear and the car becomes more oversteery from that. But if you take the aerodynamic impact on the Porsche, when the front lifts 3-4 millimeters throughout the stint, it takes away a lot of downforce from the front, and thus the car becomes more understeery from an aero perspective. Now, you can argue how big each of those impacts is. So you could say the aero impact is something like that, but the wear impact on the Porsche is a little bit larger, and maybe the whole weight balance shift is more drastic as well. And then we get the overall new balance for the Porsche, which is something like slightly more oversteer. Probably the Porsche drivers wouldn't agree with me, but it's just an idea here, right? It's not perfect. If we adjust the numbers, maybe it will look a bit better. Okay, I hope that already gives a rough idea. Now we want to talk about how we bring these things better together. Outtake. Let's have a look at ACC then, and I'll try to show you the things that you need to look out for to A, assess how the car is going to change throughout the stint, and B, how to address it in the setup. So let's go to the game. And well, this is one of the great features ACC has, and I believe iRacing has it too. I'm not sure about R Factor, but anyway, we're in free practice. That's important because in hot lap and hot stint, this function is not available. And I mean the fuel test thingy. What I've done here now, the car's fully loaded 108 liters, and the car like this, if I leave the pits, will have a balance of minus 0.4. Since the fuel tank is in the back of the Mercedes, and I made the springs really soft for this example, so the car will lift up more as you take out the weight. If you have very stiff springs, for example, and here's the first tip, if you have very stiff springs and you change the fuel load, or the fuel empties, then from a very stiff spring, taking some weight away, it won't extend too much. If you take a really soft spring, it will extend quite a bit, taking the same amount of weight over, but I'll show you just in a second. So minus 0.4, and now as the fuel tank empties, we're going through the laps, you can see the balance is slowly changing. And more, and more, and more, and you can see the front has lifted up a millimeter, but the rear has lifted up quite a bit already. We started with 77 millimeters, and now we're already 5 millimeters up here. Let's see if we can get another just by the end of the stint. We go to 83 millimeters, so we have a shift of 6 millimeters at the rear, and what this does to the car in the end is an overall balance shift of 0.6 towards the front. So the car gets a lot more oversteery aerodynamic wise just by the fuel emptying. And what we want to achieve in the end is to get back in charge of that and kind of predict how the car will behave through the stint. So the easiest measurement now would be to have the car on a full tank and just go down maybe 2, 3, 4 clicks or something. So we're starting more understeery to begin with, and then as the fuel tank empties, look at that, we'll have a balance that stays within, well, the negative here. We still have the same shift, but we're shifting not from neutral to very oversteery, but we're shifting from understeery, slightly understeery, to slightly oversteery, at least aerodynamically speaking. At the same time, when you lower the rear, this will mean there's more weight resting on the rear to begin with, which will also aid rear traction, which means it also saves the rear tires a bit. So with the same thing here, really, we are able to address two of our problems at once. And actually the third as well, because we spoke about the weight removed from the rear, leading to a bigger shift of the weight balance to the front as well. Having the rear lower indeed is one thing to address all three at once, but is a simplistic thing. The other thing that you can do, and let's just bring it back here to show you what I mean by a stiffer spring has a bigger impact than, a stiffer spring reduces the impact of the weight change than softer spring. So we had a shift from 77 millimeters to 83 and a shift of 0.6. Now, if we just make the rear spring really, really stiff and go back to this, 108 liters minus 0.4, and now we empty the tank, and now we only have a shift of 3 millimeters all of a sudden instead of 6, and we only get a balance shift that is coming from minus 0.4 to minus 0.1, which is pretty much half the shift that we've experienced before. The only problem is in this case now you have a really stiff rear spring, so to make that work, you will also need to, well, I'm exaggerating, right? But you'll have to also make the front end stiffer to have the same mechanical balance as you had before. So if your setup started out with something like this, then if you want to minimize the effect of aero balance change over a stint, you can just run a stiffer car or a stiffer aero platform, and you'll have less of a shift in aerodynamic balance throughout the stint. Of course, having a car stiff like that comes with other problems. It might hurt the tires in terms of traction, regain of grip, so you slide more in general, which could be detrimental to wear, but I'm just trying to give you options. That's one thing. Of course, if the springs have a too big of an impact and you don't really have an issue with how large the aerodynamic impact is, maybe you can just touch the roll bars instead and change the balance with that slightly to a more generally understeery setup. So you're getting this shift here on the mechanical side in the car a little less pronounced, whereas the aero shift still is the same. It really depends, and each car in the game is different, and I think this is really where I'd say ACC sticks out a lot. Every car has its very own way to function. Every car has different ways to deal with it, and every car is unique in the sense that it has different problems and different ways to tackle those problems. And this is one thing where ACC, I'd say, is pretty much unbeatable. I'm just checking my list here. Yes, we still need to talk about the driving, and this is probably where we want to bring up Popometer and compare a bit what we can actually do in the driving. I'll try to put the videos side by side here as well. So this is the wrong chart. We have that before. Now we want to talk about the driving side of things. So I did 2 laps. This hot lap mode, spent maybe 15 minutes on its own. And again, I'm exaggerating the effect here. And let's get into this. First, we're just going to look at a lap that is driven as fast as I can. And the main things you want to watch out for, there's a lot of aggression, there's deep trail braking. I'm going to be very quick and rough with the steering wheel. I'm throwing the car around. I'll be aggressive on the throttle, trying to forcibly rotate the car. And yes, this will cost rear tire. And of course, in the qualifying session, that's no problem whatsoever. And to some degree in sprint races, it's also not going to be a problem. But as soon as your races become longer, then the tire wear will become an issue. So let's look at that lap here first. We're on Barcelona and approaching corner 1 again. We're using a lot of track there. We're trailing really deep, getting the car to rotate, getting the weight on the nose, getting the rear end a tiny bit looser, then aggressive on throttle, throw the car around, no lifting here whatsoever, throwing it again into the right-hander, bit of a lift, exploit the curb on the inside, full throttle, force the rear end around, really aggressive. This will wear the rear tire a lot. Same thing happens here, trailing quite deep, setting the rear up loose, rotation starts there, keeping it alive with an aggressive throttle input, pull the car around the corner, And this same pattern will just keep going through all the other corners. Just trail the brakes every corner really deep, make the rear end loose, and before the weight can settle, you're back on the power to get the car to rotate, or let's say keep the rotation alive, right? We're really forcing the car around the track quite aggressively, relying on the electronics, relying on the ABS and TC to keep the car in check and exploit a little more rotation than we could otherwise control if we didn't have those aids. But it all comes at the cost of rear tire wear. Let's just finish up the lap here. This is one of the corners where you can do something like this as well. A pretty pronounced double apex, hard on the throttle, get the rear around. That was a bit hesitant here. Definitely in second gear. Then down here you can be aggressive with the transition with a lot of throttle, force the rear around, throw it in. Now with the weight up in the air on the rear, make an aggressive transition from left to right to get the rear a little loose, then hard on the power. This is how you do a hot lap. But we have more. And then now let's look at the lap where I'm taking out a bit of speed and I'm doing a few adjustments. And what you really want to look at here is I'm now much less aggressive. I will not be trailing the brakes as deep into the corner. I will not be as aggressive on throttle. There will be a longer rolling or coasting phase, and also the transitions in the steering won't be as aggressive. There will be several situations where the car has a tendency to lose rear end grip, to maybe become a bit oversteery, and every time you'll see I'm doing something on the throttle, on the brake, on the steering to minimize the amount of oversteer the car is creating in an attempt to save the rear tires. Again, everything here is a bit overly pronounced just to make that point, and there's also a tiny bit of a line shift in some corners that can help. Use a bit more front tires, save a bit more of the rear. So let's go into this lap. Again, approaching the first corner, the braking is already going to be ever so slightly earlier, so I get a little longer coasting phase. I might have a tiny bit more steering angle, not as quickly on the power, not all the way flat out through the first two, and also into the third corner here. I'm just going slower onto the throttle and letting the rear end settle before requesting the power of the engine, which allows the rear tires to build grip before I'm releasing the power of the engine. Same here in this long right-hander. No deep trailing this time around, more gentle on the throttle, and not trying to create excessive rotation is the key here. And often it's enough to give the car a tenth or two to settle and then not slam the power as aggressively, be a bit more gentle, and this way your tires will be thanking you a lot for not attacking them as harshly. Let's finish up this lap here as well, and you also see here in the hairpin, again, not trailing as deeply, have a bit of coasting in between, not as aggressive on the throttle, just giving the car time to put the weight back on the rear tires. And here, there's one thing additionally you can do, not just taking a tighter line, having a bit more steering angle, creating a bit more understeer, but also the short shift on exit helps a lot by not accidentally releasing too much power of the engine. Last corner, not much you can do here, but you've saved the tire for the rest of the lap, so you can still be aggressive here through the last 2-3 corners. And then we have a lap that in this case is like a full second down, I believe, to what we had before, but this is really just to emphasize everything. So I want to take a look at Motec here. Oh, well, not Motec, but Popometer, of course, because everything I've just said we should be able to see here as well. Going for turn 1, let's bring that to the center of attention. You can't really spot any difference here in the line I'm taking. Maybe you can see I've been a bit tighter here, but this is within the normal variance I have in my driving as well. The main thing you can see is here, while the colored line, which is the faster lap, still has quite a bit of trail braking deep into the corner, pretty much up until the curb here. The other lap is done with the braking pretty much here, right? That's way before the curb starts, and now the car is in a rolling phase that's maybe 2-3 car lengths or whatever. And then if we zoom in further, and because these things are subtle, right? You can see the throttle application from the faster lap being much more aggressive. Again, the the actual line that I do in an actual race is probably in between those two. This is really just to highlight the differences that you can do. So I'm much less aggressive on the throttle here, giving the car a tiny bit more time to shift the rate rearwards, allow the rear tires to build the grip now, so I'm not sliding around that much. Then here, car coming off the curb, again, not trying to rely too much on the electronics, but instead just I'm easing a bit on the car by releasing the throttle here ever so slightly, and we can already tell by the overall amount maybe of the traction control here. The green line just popping up more often than the black line, indicating that, yeah, more aggression there in the fast lap, more TC intervention in the fast lap. And this will just go on in turn 2 as well, which is here. Once we go over the left side curb there, you can see now the lift on the throttle is a little bigger, again giving the car a little more time, not requesting everything too aggressively. And here on the exit as well, where the car has the tendency to snap potentially, again I'm just being ever so slightly a tiny bit easy on the throttle there to not force the car to create too much rotation, just live with a tiny bit less. Then something else you'll be able to see, let's zoom in just here on the transitions from turn 1 to 2 and turn 2 to 3, is in the steering. The red line is really aggressive from one side to the other in both cases, just going faster from peak to peak, from one side to the other. I'm throwing the car around more aggressively, and the black trace should show that everything is a bit more gentle with the car. I'm not doing things so quickly. I'm not trying to overwhelm the car deliberately. I'm trying to work within the limits of the car instead of forcing the limits onto a certain axle. Then in turn 3 itself, you can see again my lift here, for example, is not as aggressive. I'm not shifting all the way to the front that aggressively. I'm not trying to create too much rotation. I'm not as aggressive back onto the power, and I'm also not trying to exploit the inside curb this time around to create rotation. Instead, I just let the car go a bit and then go much smoother into the throttle. Of course, this cost me a lot of exit speed here, losing some, yes, probably a tenth or a bit more here up until turn 4. But again, I've done this here to the extreme just to get the data to show you. So the reality will be somewhere in between, right? A bit more aggression, but definitely less aggressive than the hot lap there is. Turn 4, I'm hoping to see more differences, to be honest. You can see the braking here much more aggressive, allowing more in the ABS in the hot lap, whereas the trail braking here starts much earlier for the tire saving lap. And same thing that happens, the trail braking here, not as pronounced, again, giving the car time to settle before requesting much of the grip. And just a tiny correction there on the brake, and then again letting the car roll longer, deeper into the corner, and the throttle application not as aggressive, not as peaky, and much more gentle until releasing full power. The other thing we can see is, and that we can go a little closer, the slightly transparent line is the slower one, the tire saving one. I'm going earlier for the corner and with a little more speed, which is why the trail braking starts earlier. And now I have a little excess speed in a slightly more compromised line. I still need to work off speed deeper into the corner, which you'll see here. So now I have a slightly different line that forces the car to be a bit more understeery for a longer period of time, deeper into the corner. I have a more pronounced furthest away point in the corner, a more pronounced slowest point in the corner that is a tiny bit later than before, and I'm not forcing the car around as much on the throttle. So what I'm doing essentially is I'm using more of the front tire by going into the corner at a slightly shallower angle, working off speed over the front tire by going into it a tiny bit too quick. We'll also see there's a difference in the steering angle, where I now have a bit more steering angle applied on the front axle, creating ever so slightly or ever so tiny amounts of forced understeer, which also uses the front tire more, takes some work of the rear tire, and then don't go for the fallacy and thinking, okay, now I have to get this rotational on the exit. No, be easy. Give the car time, take some pace out of it, and try to never get the rear upset. The same thing will go on for the other corners. Always more gentle braking, less deep braking, more coasting, more easy throttle application, like here in turn 5. down here, you can see more steering angle, throttle application, a little more gentle, saving some of the rear tire. This will go on and on across the whole track. So I'm just skipping forward a bit to turn 10, 11, where we had one more method that you can do. And that really is what I mentioned already with the short shift. So in this corner, you can also carry a tiny bit of excess speed. I didn't do in this, well, a tiny amount. Well, just ever so slightly quicker here on the slower lap into the corner, working speed off with a little more forced understeer, which you can see here in the increased steering trace. Braking very similar in this one, already had coasting in that corner, but again, the throttle not as aggressive, not as early, not as quickly to the maximum. And the main thing here, just as I go into the throttle, this is where the short shift is going to happen, because third gear makes it much easier to control if the rear end will step out or not. You just don't have that much power to begin with, and that makes it easier for the rear tires to live longer, essentially. So I hope these kind of things maybe summarize real quick, right? We have 3 effects. We have tire wear most of the time being imbalanced and the rear wearing more, creating oversteer throughout the stint. Then we have the next effect, which is the fuel emptying, and depending if the car has the tank on the front or in the back, will lead to a shift in the weight balance of the car and will lead to a shift 3 of the aerodynamics of the car. And it is really unique how each car in ACC responds. So know your car, know how it behaves when the fuel tank empties. And then we saw how we can potentially tackle it. The easiest way is certainly to just change the ride heights in response to how the balance changes. So just reduce 2-3 millimeters or whatever. Start with a more understeery car to get a more or less extreme oversteer at the end. Or if you have an oversteery car that gets understeery, then maybe you want to start with one that's even more oversteery to begin with, so the understeer doesn't become as brutal towards the end. The other bit was you could see that with a generally stiffer platform, stiffer springs, the aerodynamic balance will not shift as drastically, even though a hard setup will have other, or will bring other problems that will be around traction, regain of grip, that sort of stuff. Okay, I hope this got your ideas, and I guess I'll put these labs up for comparison in the public team I have on Popometer, where everybody can join, and then you can compare this lab. And then I wish you a great week. Bye. Over the last couple of months, we've been developing our own telemetry software around ACC. It's called Popometer.io, and it's geared towards everyone who seriously wants to improve their driving and lap times. We are working together with a lot of professional esports players and engineers on the game of ACC who are creating data packs that always includes a setup and telemetry data. This telemetry data then is visualized on our platform and very easy to access. You pretty much don't need to do anything. It's much easier than Motec, for example. And you can view side by side what the inputs are that you do and what the inputs are of a professional esports driver. Additionally, we have found a way to visualize the line, which makes it really easy to compare where you're placing the car and eventually where you are losing the time. So if you're a very determined sim racer who wants to improve their lap times, probably worth checking out Popometer.io and give it a go.